Al Jazeera podcasts.
Today, as the U.S. meets with Russia, are the U.S. and Europe parting ways?
The shift in policy under US President Donald Trump has forced Europe to face a new reality, that if it is to survive, it must be able to defend itself.
So, how will Europe respond? And what does this mean for Russia, Ukraine, and the future of the war? I'm Kevin Hirten, and this is The Take. It was a wild weekend at the Munich Security Conference. U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance kicked it off with what was billed as a speech on Trump's roadmap to peace in Ukraine.
But while the Trump administration is very concerned with European security and believes that we can come to a reasonable settlement between Russia and Ukraine.
But his focus was really how Europe is failing to pull its weight.
And we also believe that it's important in the coming years for Europe to step up in a big way to provide for its own defense.
U.S. Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth went even further.
Allies, now is the time to invest, because you can't make an assumption that America's presence will last forever.
Signaling the U.S.'s willingness to pull back on security guarantees that have been around for decades. He announced Ukraine would not retake territory, would not be invited into NATO, and European peacekeepers would not have American backing either. Now, Hegseth later walked back some of that, but Europe was still left reeling.
There's a sense of urgency in Europe, a realization that the continent can no longer rely on the United States for its security, and unless it acts fast, its very future could be at stake.
I'm Tristan Redman, and I'm Al Jazeera English Paris bureau producer, and I cover French news and European news and sometimes some other stuff too.
So, Tristan, it is great to have you on again. This time last week, I'm sure you had no idea that Europe's major powers would be gathering in Paris for a crisis meeting. And the topic just couldn't be bigger, right? The possible dismantling of the Western alliance that has endured since the end of World War II. You've described what we're living through as an existential moment for Europe. What do you mean by that?
Oh, absolutely. I've been covering European politics for quite a long time, and I cannot remember a moment like this where it feels like the whole kind of edifice is teetering and it could collapse. I just don't remember a moment like this, and it's all happened very, very quickly.
Yeah. So this meeting, who was there? What did they talk about? What did they conclude, if anything?
Okay, so this meeting was called at very, very short notice by Emmanuel Macron, the French president. And there was kind of a scramble to make it happen. And I guess it's just quite hard to get a bunch of heads of state and government at very, very short notice in a capital city, 24 hours or so. And so on Monday, they all descended on Paris. And who was there? So you had the EU leaders, you had Ursula von der Leyen, you had Antonio Costa. You had the Prime Minister of Britain, Keir Starmer, who, normally these days does not participate in meetings with other EU leaders after Brexit. The Italian Prime Minister, Giorgia Meloni, the Polish Prime Minister, the Danish Prime Minister was representing all the Scandinavian states. The Secretary General of NATO, Mark Rutte, was there. And they were basically called together to kind of come up with some kind of emergency reaction to Trump's rapprochement with Putin and the decision that these two men are going to hash out the future of Ukraine just between the two of them, apparently in Saudi Arabia in the very near future.
So this was set into motion because of what the United States signaled during the weekend.
Well, the Munich Security Conference last week was kind of like it was a sort of a hors d'oeuvre, if you like, a starter. So you had Pete Hegseth there, and then the biggest waves were made by J.D. Vance, the US Vice President. Both of them made speeches, and it became pretty clear quite quickly that this was not going to be business as usual as far as the transatlantic relationship was concerned. In fact, the president of the Munich Security Conference, which is kind of an annual gathering of, the great and the good from the international security infrastructure, he was actually in tears in his closing speech.
Yeah.
Supposedly because he was so disturbed by the things he'd heard in the last few days. J.D. Vance admonished European leaders in Munich. He basically told them that as far as he was concerned, the threat to Europe did not come from Russia. It came from the so-called threat from within.
The threat that I worry the most about vis-a-vis Europe is not Russia, it's not China, it's not any other external actor. And what I worry about is the threat from within, the retreat of Europe from some of its most fundamental values, values shared with the United States of America.
What he meant by that is, depending on who you listen to, it's more to do with a particular idea of free speech, aligning with his particular views. So he's been roundly criticized for that.
Right.
J.D. Vance has.
So these speeches scramble these European leaders into action, and action looks like a big meeting in Paris. What comes out of this meeting?
Well, unfortunately, not very much. In spite of all this,
the Judean People's Front, right? Like this calls for immediate discussion.
Yeah, it was kind of a sound and fury signifying nothing, and this was a moment that called for European leaders who have been steadfast in their support of Ukraine for the last 3 years to stand up and say, no, we are not okay with the abandonment of Ukraine. Mm-hmm. We will stand behind Ukraine. And based on what we saw on Monday in Paris, they failed to do that.
Wow.
And that has left a lot of people scratching their heads and asking, if the European Union is not for this, what exactly is it for? So they don't really seem to have a bargaining position. And that's incredibly worrying for the future of the EU if you're somebody who believes in the European project.
Right. So part of the point of a meeting like this is to project a united front, but there are divisions, right? Europe is this collection of different nations, each with its own priorities. So what are some of the cleavages that you're monitoring within Europe?
Well, the most obvious cleavage in Europe is between, the old school European establishment who believe in order and very slow reform. But there is a new brand of European leader coming through. The most prominent one is Viktor Orban of Hungary, but there are others, Robert Fico of Slovakia. We may soon see a far-right leader in France. We may eventually see a far-right leader in Germany. Giorgia Meloni in Italy is, possibly one of the most prominent at the moment. Mm-hmm. And these leaders see the EU in a very different way. They believe that Europe should be a much kind of looser federation of nation states and not a project moving to so-called ever greater union, a kind of federation of Europe. And those leaders from these kind of hard right or far right countries, they look much more to Russia than to the United States or Brussels for leadership. And countries like Hungary and Slovakia are probably quite pleased about what's happening right now.
Yeah, I see what you mean by existential, right? Because the whole point of the European project was to band together. You'll be stronger as a collective, as opposed to like this collection of individual states. And all of the political energy seems to be towards these far-right leaders that will prioritize their specific national goals over the greater good of the collective.
Absolutely. Those far-right leaders around Europe, they have the political momentum right now. Europe is changing very, very fast. So the traditional motors of the European Union are France and Germany. Now, Macron in France is kind of a lame duck president. He's serving out the rest of his term until 2027, but he doesn't have that much margin for maneuver. Germany is probably about to go through a political change. There's an election coming up this weekend, and we don't know what's going to emerge from that. So Olaf Scholz, the Chancellor of Germany, is somewhat weakened in his position. Italy is obviously another very powerful European nation, and Italy is led by Giorgia Meloni, who's a far-right leader who's close to Donald Trump, whose party has roots in the fascist party of Benito Mussolini. And it was notable on Monday at the summit that when Giorgia Meloni arrived, she arrived 50 minutes late for the summit. She arrived in a beautiful Maserati car and a kind of quite striking white woolen coat. And in all the photographs that were taken of the leaders, she was kind of seen scowling. No one really knows what she thinks. And that's probably quite symbolic of this kind of new force in European politics, that she was a bit of an outlier at this meeting on Monday.
So what does this mean for Ukraine? That's after the break. So Tristan, the other big meeting that's happening is in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio and Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov are meeting ahead of a possible summit between Putin and Trump. They say they are laying the groundwork for ending the war in Ukraine. But something's missing here, right? No Ukraine, no Europe. Tristan, how can you have a peace talk to end a war and not include the country where the war is actually happening?
Well, that is precisely the question that many, many people in Europe are asking themselves. And I think the very simple answer goes back to something that J.D. Vance, the U.S. Vice President, said a couple of years ago.
I think it's ridiculous that we're focused on this border in Ukraine. I got to be honest with you, I don't really care what happens to Ukraine one way or another.
Now, I think the answer to why is Ukraine not at the table is found in that statement. I think probably Donald Trump agrees with J.D. Vance on that. They're not that interested in the future of Ukraine. There is a whole branch of the U.S. government right now that is much, much more concerned by a kind of security pivot to Asia. Europe is not a priority. They don't really care, it would seem, if Ukraine is left undefended or not.
I think the line I heard was Europe wants a just peace and Trump wants just peace.
Well, yes. I mean, I think that's a very nice line. I think there are many people who dispute the idea that Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin's claim to be great peacemakers at this point is disingenuous. Donald Trump has made it very clear that he is interested in essentially war reparations from Ukraine.
I told them that I want the equivalent, like $500 billion worth of rare earth. And they've essentially agreed to do that. So at least we don't feel stupid.
So he has a kind of financial interest in a settlement in Ukraine, but not so much a security interest. The British newspaper, the Daily Telegraph, got access to the proposed document, which was a settlement proposal for Ukraine of how much money they would have to pay to the United States. And the Telegraph has calculated that, in fact, the conditions being set on Ukraine are more onerous financially than the terms that were dictated to Germany at the Treaty of Versailles at the end of the First World War.
So what could go wrong?
Well, exactly. Yeah. I mean, it's pretty well known that the Treaty of Versailles and those kind of onerous conditions that were laid down on Germany had pretty disastrous consequences. And, you know, Germany in 1918 was a defeated nation. Mm-hmm. Ukraine is still nominally fighting and nominally an ally of the United States and Europe. So to dictate the terms of a vanquished nation to Kyiv is incredibly harsh. So normally you would expect a quid pro quo, right? But that doesn't appear to be on the table here. Trump is basically just saying, you owe us money, we supported you, pay us back the money, but we're not going to defend you either.
Let's just talk about Zelensky and Ukraine and what his strategy is, or what you think his strategy might be to manage all of this.
Well, I'm not totally sure that he has a strategy at this moment in time. He is essentially a supplicant. He doesn't even have a place at the negotiating table. There was a piece in Le Monde actually written in France about the quote unquote loneliness of Volodymyr Zelensky.
Yeah.
One of the things that they latched onto was the fact that he has changed the way he dresses. So if you remember, for most of the early part of the war, he dressed all in green, in kind of military fatigues, like sort of military trousers and like a sweatshirt, sort of maroon, sort of olive green military color. And now he dresses almost entirely in black, always. And Le Monde was talking about the kind of slightly mournful figure that he cuts. There is a thinking that one of the things that Zelensky is doing is doubling down on something that is a very risky gamble. So saying to Trump, essentially, okay, we will give you a huge chunk of our GDP, so money that you can extract from rare earth minerals, coal, iron, etc. And even knowing full well that he's not going to get any security guarantees in return, his gamble may be that would at least involve having US companies on the ground, but it's hardly a substitute for US forces.
Yeah, I heard somebody posted this, I can't remember who it was. Russia and US are at the table, Ukraine is on the menu. So if that's the dynamic, I mean, what is realistically the best case peace plan? I mean, what would you see is like a decent outcome at this stage for Ukraine?
I mean, it's a pretty bleak outlook for Ukraine right now. They're going to lose most likely around 20% of their territory. They are almost certainly not going to get any guarantee that they will join NATO at any time in the future, because Putin has made that clear he's not okay with that. They might get to join the EU, but at this point, that's looking exponentially a less attractive proposition with every passing day. It would seem that Ukraine is not really going to attain any of its war aims. So the very best case scenario for Ukraine at this point is that the EU somehow scrabbles together some kind of peacekeeping force, boots on the ground in Ukraine, and has the appetite to spend the money and commit the manpower that would protect Ukraine from another Russian invasion. And there are big question marks over the European capacity to do that.
Yeah, I mean, how much of this is just completely self-inflicted by Europe, the inevitable result of outsourcing your security to the United States for just so many years? It's finally it's coming back to bite them.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's something that President Emmanuel Macron of France has been warning against for some years now. So you may remember back in the early days of his presidency, he gave this interview to The Economist in which he referred to NATO as being, quote, brain dead. And that caused, quite a lot of consternation, this idea that, NATO was basically defunct and served no purpose. But I think at this point, he's been kind of proven right that Europe needed to think a lot more smartly about its own strategic autonomy. And now Europe is scrambling to do what Emmanuel Macron has been telling it to do since 2017.
And he's on his way out. Yeah.
And he's on his way out. It reminds me, actually, do you remember that conversation in the Hemingway book? It's the famous one about how did you go bankrupt? One of the characters is asked, and his reply
slowly
is
and then
two ways. Slowly and then all of a sudden, or gradually and then suddenly, I think is the answer.
Wow.
And it's a bit like that. So, gradually the European Union has failed to look after its own security because it lived in this kind of cozy world in which the United States was there and was going to take care of things. And then all of a sudden, within the last week, 10 days, the whole kind of edifice looks like it's about to crumble down.
Wow.
And European leaders are really scrambling. Unless, of course, you are in the sort of axis of Orban, Meloni, Robert Fico, in which case you're kind of enjoying what's happening right now.
Right. But it's like there's two crises happening at once, because if this had happened 30 years ago when Europe was much more united, they might be able to mount some sort of defense. But it's happening exactly when Europe is fracturing with all of these right-wing movements coming in all the states.
Absolutely. And, even the leaders in the European Union who appear to be kind of securely in position, most of them have got some kind of far-right, hard-right opposition party coming up their right flank. And they just need to be really careful about how they play things. And they have to be hyper-conscious of the idea that European voters are not prepared to give a blank check to Ukraine.
So much of this sounds like we're talking about Russia as if it is the Soviet Union and that nothing has changed and it's one of the two great powers. But Are we overstating Russia's strength at all here? I mean, Russia's not exactly crushing it right now. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers were lost. Infrastructure, military hardware was just churned up by this war. I mean, the notion that Europe is just powerless in the face of this, do you feel like that's a bit overstated?
Well, I mean, that's the very heart of the debate in a lot of corners right now, right? So on the one hand, you're right. Russia has not crushed it in Ukraine. Their military has been shown to be, in many places, corrupt, incompetent, outdated, badly equipped, incapable of defeating a much, much smaller military force, a much, much smaller country. And in that sense, maybe European nations should have some comfort. So is Russia really capable, ready to kind of launch a ground war in Europe? I mean, probably not. But there is another way to think of it, which is your power is based on who your friends are. And essentially what we've just seen is American friendliness and strategic support switching from old allies in Europe and that strategic friendliness and support moving lock stock to Moscow. And so you are as strong as your allies are. And right now, Vladimir Putin feels a lot stronger than he did a couple of weeks ago because he has basically been told that the United States is giving him carte blanche to act as he pleases in Europe, and they are not going to intervene. So, you know, I think although Russia is economically and militarily not what it once was, they do have strong backing, and it's a very worrying time for European nations, certainly Western European nations.
Okay, the last question is, so is there any putting the genie back in the bottle in 4 years, say a new president comes along, or is there something permanent here, something that's been then shattered from the European perspective?
I think the latter. I think it's something permanent. Now, whether that means, the end of the European Union as we know it, at the end of NATO as we know it, is obviously not clear. But I think European leaders have now learned very, very quickly in the space of about 10 days that whatever happens, they cannot trust that the United States will always be there. I think it's changed forever now in the sense that they just can't afford to be in a situation like this ever again.
Well, I think we'll have to end it there. Tristan, Redman, thank you for coming on The Take.
Thanks so much for having me.
And that's The Take. Look, so much is happening these days, so we really thank you for stopping by for just a minute to get beyond the headlines. And, let us know what's been worrying you, what's exciting you, what stories would you like us to take on? Look, let us know in the comments. We'll be reading them. We always do. We're curious about what you have to say. So we'll be back tomorrow.